Hello, I'm Michael Pearson. This is The Human Condition. Today we're talking about antibodies and medical testing for allergies and autoimmune conditions and skin dermatitis and other types of problems like that. The tendency in America today is to order a lot of antibody testing. The antibodies can be measured against invading organisms, so antibodies against viruses and bacteria and worms and protozoans and invading organisms, which is one thing. They can be for food, antibodies against food items to see if we have allergies or sensitivities, which I'll get into. And antibodies can also be made, tests can be made against yourself. So there can be a whole range of antibody tests that are anti-self antibodies, so autoantibodies. So those might be tests, instead of food or bugs, they might be tests for your cerebellum, tests for antibodies against your heart, tests for antibodies against your testes or ovaries, antibodies against your blood vessel lining or your peripheral nerves or your central nerves. There's all kinds of antibody tests that can be against self. So those three different categories behave differently. And I think one of the things that drives a patient to a doctor for an antibody test and that drives the doctor to order an antibody test is frustration. The most common by far clinical scenario that I see in 25 years of practice is patients come in with a skin disorder and a reaction that's a non-classical histamine reaction. So if they come to a doctor and they say, I've got a reaction to something and I don't know what it is, it's not histamine, which means it's not these symptoms. It's not red, itchy, watery eyes, runny nose, difficulty breathing, closed off airway, all the things that are classically considered an allergy, a classic allergy, mediated by the histamine pathway and reduced by either an EpiPen in the leg, which is the ultimate solution for the worst cases, or an antihistamine. Those are the IgE reactions. Those are immunoglobulin E, which are reserved for the most serious and the most dangerous, quite frankly, allergic reactions. So allergy is defined as that kind of pathway. Now, if you make different kinds of antibodies, you might not have a classical allergy. So if you make immunoglobulin G instead of E, the letter G, or A, or M antibodies, and there's others, antibody D and some others that we won't talk about, antibody Y, there's a bunch of stuff that we won't discuss today. But if you make these G, A, and M antibodies instead of E antibodies, it's called a non-classical pathway or non-histamine pathway or non-allergic pathway, and some people call that a sensitivity. The production of IgA starts in the mucous membranes. So if a person ingests something or is infected by an organism, it goes in their nose, it goes in their eyes, it goes in their mouth, it goes in their orifices that have mucous membrane. And the first thing it does is hit mucous membrane. It doesn't hit the blood system, it hits the mucous membrane, and the mucous membrane mounts an IgA response. And that IgA response is the first antibody that's produced. If the IgA antibody peters out and weakens and we don't make enough IgAs, or we have enough time, we'll start to make IgMs locally as well. And IgMs are a very large, expensive antibody to make. They have 5 arms on them instead of 1 or 2. They're not the classic Y shape. They are more of a star shape, a 5-sided star. And the IgM antibodies that are produced in your mucous membranes can actually kill an invading organism without calling another cell to help it. Most antibodies simply tag an organism and signal for other cells to come over, and those other cells will actually do the job of killing the organism. But IgM doesn't need any help. It can do it all by itself. So just to recap, if an organism comes into our body, our mucous membranes face it first before it hits the bloodstream, and it's IgA and IgM. If the person has exposure for long enough, and it's usually a few days to a few weeks, this organism may get into their bloodstream and their immune system may trigger IgG response. And IgG is a humoral or bloodborne response. And so your blood system will produce IgG in the blood, and you'll have circulating IgG in the blood. So IgA and IgM you'll see in the saliva and in the mucous membranes and in stool, and IgG you'll see in the blood system. Now, IgA, as it's produced in the mucous system, will spill over and make it into the bloodstream through venous drainage. Once your lymph system and your venous blood receives the leftover IgA fragments of the battle, they get into the blood circulation and they'll trigger the IgG production. Once that IgG production is made, now you've got IgA and IgG in your blood, and you probably by that point have IgM, because IgG and IgM are made roughly together. So IgA first, IgM in the mucous membranes, IgG in the blood, and IgM close on to that. Now, we're not going to go through exactly how that process happens, the interplay with IgM and IgG. That has to do with whether it's your first exposure or your second exposure to an antigen. But the whole point is that process of those four types of antibodies, immunoglobulin A, M, G, and E, is really what we're looking at. So if E is your allergy one, and A and G and M are your sensitivity ones that have to do with whether it's in your mucous membranes or in your blood, we have to look at what happens when a person gets exposed to food or gets exposed to other antigens. Most people don't start out with an autoimmune disease. They start out with some kind of infection or some kind of food reaction. And there's a lot of molecular mimicry going on because the proteins and sugars and glycans that are on the surface of a cell, whether it's an invading cell or a food cell that you're eating, there's not a lot of them out there. There's not many choices. It's like, how many colors of blue can I wear? How many different styles can a guy wear? There's only so many, and at some point, if you're looking, you might mistake somebody for somebody else, and that's in fact what happens. The immune system might mistake a protein or a sugar or glycan or a proteoglycan for something else, and it might say, oh, you're an invading organism, when really it's just a piece of tomato, or really it's just a piece of gluten, or it's just, in some cases, it's your brain. It's part of your cerebellum or part of your basal ganglia. And so the immune system makes a mistake and equates a food with a bacteria or a spirochete, or confuses your own, God forbid, your own self with that. So that's part of how that process happens. So if you're trying to unravel all this and you have a problem where you eat something and you react to it and you get a skin rash and you go to your doctor may do an antibody test, and the antibody test may come back negative. If it comes back negative, it means nothing really pinged your immune system and you didn't have a really strong reaction, or you had a reaction to foods you don't eat right now, which is confusing. So usually when that happens, we have to go back to the old textbooks. And this is my favorite part of this medicine. If you look at old textbooks that have been around for a long time, you can see that it's very clear that most skin reactions are atopic dermatitis or skin atopy or eczema. And they are a redness or white flakiness of the skin where the skin gets angry and red and raised in patches, and it becomes scratchy and flaky and dry, and it alternates and peels off and comes and goes. And it's often in folds of the skin. It's often in the folds of the elbow. It's often in the ears, behind the ears. It's on the scalp. It's on the legs. By far the most common lesions is this skin atopy. And the textbooks will tell you that most atopic dermatitis or skin atopy or eczema is not caused by antibodies. It's called non-antibody atopy. And this non-antibody reaction means you don't make any antibodies to it. Your immune system reacts without antibodies. And you might ask, well, how does that happen? Well, there's a whole load of immune reactions that are not antibody-based. And in this world of COVID, I want to kind of remind everybody that there's a world of immunity that's not antibody-based. We have the complement system, which is essentially a bunch of proteins that come together with a signal, and they drill holes in the hull of the ship of the enemy. So they're just like in the Civil War when soldiers would go under the water and drill holes in ships and sink them. Complement does the same thing, and it's very, very old evolutionarily. Complement system is the oldest part of our immune system, way older than antibodies evolutionarily, and it evolved way before antibodies evolved. So there's the complement system, which can be tested for. There's also the T cell system, or the natural killer cell system, which are cells that can actually go to an organism and kill it without requiring antibodies to be made. We also have macrophages and monocytes. These are cells that are white cells that can attack an organism and kill it without antibody signal. So we don't necessarily have to make antibodies. So you may be thinking, well, gee, if I don't make antibodies and I'm antibody negative for all these foods, maybe there's a reason for my food reaction, and it maybe still is a sensitivity that's a non-antibody mediated reaction. So you might ask yourself, well, how would I figure that out? Well, you'd have to do an elimination diet, and very likely you have problems with lectins. Lectins are proteins that are in foods that can trigger a reaction that may or may not be antibody-based. A person can react to the lectins in food and not have any antibodies. On the other hand, a person may have massive amounts of antibodies in their blood or in their saliva or other tissues to food and decide that that's what they're going to use as a measure. But it might be a false positive that doesn't help you. If you're under a great deal of stress, you might be making a whole lot of what are called protective antibodies. It's important to understand that when a human makes antibodies, for humans and mammals, nearly 50% of all antibodies circulating in serum for most mammals are protective antibodies. They're not destructive antibodies. They don't tag a cell for destruction, like in classic Hashimoto's thyroid disease. They don't latch onto an organ and signal destruction. They tag a tissue and say, leave this tissue alone. And so that protective antibody system is something that we're not talking a lot about in the world of antibody testing. So a doctor and a patient shouldn't freak out if they do a test and they find a ton of autoantibodies where a person has antibodies against everything in their body. There may just have been a stressful event, and that stressful event caused a flare of protective antibodies, which is fairly common. We don't like that to happen a lot because it's a harbinger of future autoimmune disease. But we would like to see that person come back down and get back to normal, and they may not have a permanent autoimmunity. So if you have an autoimmune tests positive for your own tissue, don't consider that you always have that and you now have been diagnosed with a permanent autoimmune condition, because you have to do subsequent testing of IgG and IgA and other things to make sure that you don't have that. And we'll get to those technical tests later. I'm just trying to give an overview right now. So you may be thinking to myself, well, if I have low antibodies or high antibodies to food or to self, I may not necessarily be healthy or diseased. And that's what I'm trying to tell you. Yes, you may not be. I'm going to even make it more confusing for just a moment. Let's say that you order a bunch of antibody tests and they come back and you have no antibodies that are in the danger zone. You have normal, dull range of antibodies. And so you say, well, I have some antibodies, not zero. Is that a terrible thing? No. In fact, it's a part of the body's accounting system to have a low level of antibodies to everything. It's very common to have a normal range of antibodies. So if someone tells you you should have zero antibodies for a particular substance, that doesn't really fit. The human system is kind of a nosy, busybody system, and it likes to keep tabs on everything. So there is usually some small level of antibodies against everything, which means antibodies that are specific, monoclonal. It means they've been made to stick to a certain thing, and they will stick to those things. So that means that there's a small amount of antibodies to dairy, or a small amount of antibodies to gluten, or a small amount of antibodies to chicken, or fish, or your cerebellum, or your heart, or your testes. So to have zero antibodies is not your goal. To have a normal range of antibodies is your goal. So you might say, well, I came back with a normal negative test. I didn't have any antibodies that were above the normal limit. I had some dull roar of antibodies, but not above the normal range. Now that doesn't necessarily mean you're out of the woods. You might have suppressed antibody production. If you have global suppressed antibody production, you can do a cheap test that's about $20 where you go and get your blood drawn and you have what's called total serum IgA, IgM, IgG, and IgE. And what that does is it measures all of these antibodies in your body collectively and says, do you have too much or too little of each of the four classes? So that possibility exists. If you have too little of one of those classes, you have an insufficient immune production and you may need to see an immunologist. Likewise, if you have too much beyond the normal range, you may have an overreaction of the immune system and you may need to see an immunologist. In alternative medicine, there are some really good ways of controlling T regulatory cells using fat-soluble vitamins and minerals and detoxification methods. There's also a great deal of Chinese patent medicines in traditional Chinese medicine that work with acupuncture and herbal formulas to help normalize bone marrow, because in that case, the bone marrow is the problem because the person's producing too many antibodies. And so we want to make sure that they don't have, obviously, a leukemia or some kind of a difficult problem or strange cancers. But generally, we want to make sure that they don't have too much or too little of these antibodies. So likewise, a person could also go have a food antibody test and have everything hit as high, and they haven't done a basic total serum antibody test. So a total serum antibody test tests the total amount of IgMs and Gs and As and Es. It doesn't test the individual ones like you might be used to, like an IgG to apricots or an IgM to rice. Those are individual antibodies of each class to an individual antigen. An antigen is, of course, the thing you're testing for, which is what are you reacting to? Are you reacting to a bug? Are you reacting to a food? Are you reacting to yourself somehow? So that's the 3 categories of testing with the 4 categories of antibodies. So I hope that introduction helps you, and there are lots of ways to help normalize this process. There's lots of ways to help a person improve. There are many methods used to help reduce this antibody response. So if you do have an antibody response that's high, it doesn't necessarily mean that your problem is purely antibody-based. It may also be non-antibody-based, and it may be antibody-based, but you don't know until you measure these things and you look at your body with a broader perspective. I'll end by saying that some people will use Perilla or Shiso tea, which is a great herb that's used to reduce to increase the lymphatic drainage, reduce the lymphatic load, because a lot of people have debris. They have leftover debris of the carcasses of, say, Candida, or the carcasses of old bacteria, or probiotics even, healthy bacteria that have been destroyed and cleaned out. We can have the carcasses of healthy and unhealthy bacteria in our body that need to come out of us, and they can clog our lymphatic system and create a minefield that really irritates the immune system and makes your body think it's under attack, simply because there's just so much debris hanging around in your extracellular fluid or your lymphatic fluid, or even your blood or your digestive tract or your digestive fluids. This problem can happen, and we just need lymphatic drainage. Good lymphatic drainage involves Shiso or Perilla. It involves a rebounder, some kind of a bouncy trampoline or that kind of action, trampoline action. Ice is a very good way. Swimming is a very good way to pump the lymphatics. Exercise in general is a good way to pump the lymphatics. A whirlpool sauna with jets that blast your muscles is a great way to do that. And of course, eating fiber is a great way to do that. Now, fiber is useful to clean out the gut, but we're learning about some problems with fiber when we look at carnivore diets and we look at, ketogenic diets. So you don't have to use fiber necessarily. There are other ways to do that, things like magnesium and other methods. So don't get bogged down with old methods necessarily. Just know that you can have a clogged lymphatic system.